Welcome back. I was about to start studying the Lucena position, which is the next endgame theory idea that I need to study and get my head wrapped around, but then I realized I had just passed a milestone. This is my 500th win with the black pieces, according to my records. And so I'm just going to go through. It wasn't a very long game, but there were a couple of places where both my opponent and I could have done better. Okay, just a couple of caveats. I'm not including all the games I've ever played with black pieces. Only the games that I've played since I began playing online in the last year and a half or so, combining both Lichess and Chess.com. This one happened to be on Chess.com, but I am keeping a separate file that keeps track of all my games on both sites, including Daily and Rapid and Blitz. I'm not including any bullet games because those don't count. Okay, my opponent had the white pieces and played e4, so I respond with the Caro-Kann, which I have been learning. And we got this position here in which, at this point, I usually expect my opponent to either move forward or take, which are the advanced variation and the exchange variation, respectively. Next most common, I think here I see knight to f3 or knight to c3. Every now and then, knight to d2. My opponent played knight to c3, which I expected. At this point, I take the pawn, and usually here they take back. My opponent surprised me here by not playing that, which I think is, let's show the engine with this button right there. Yeah, it's showing knight captures on e4 as the only move that maintains any advantage for white. But my opponent surprised me by playing h3. Perhaps what they were thinking is that I very often will get my bishop out here after they take this, and then they will play this and then this in order to drive my bishop back here after I've moved my h-pawn. If you're not familiar with the Caro-Kann, then just ignore all that. But it looks like they maybe got these out of order just a little bit. So anyway, I wasn't sure how to respond here because I had never reached that exact position before. So I just decided to defend my front e-pawn. I have two e-pawns now by playing knight to f6, which turned out to be okay. And my opponent now is supposed to play this, which is not intuitive because it blocks in the bishop. So I'm not sure exactly why that is suggested as the best move. Or go ahead and play g4. Since you already played h3, play g4, and then that will prevent my bishop entirely from coming out. But they didn't do either one of those. They instead defended this pawn, which was already defended by the queen. Maybe they thought I was about to attack it again, perhaps with the pawn push. I'm not sure. Normally, I don't go after this pawn after this position's been broken open. Normally, you go after this pawn after they've advanced their e-pawn, and we're in the advanced variation, and they're kind of cramping me because this pawn is still back here. But regardless, they played that, perhaps intending to castle queenside. Maybe that was their idea. Now they can get their queen out and castle queenside. But since they did not play g4 yet, I went ahead and played bishop to f5 here. Then they played g4, which, again, not that much of a big deal because even if I had already played my bishop here and then they played those two moves, I would slide it back, and if they brought this forward trying to trap my bishop, I would move my h-pawn in order to take my bishop all the way back. That's fairly common in some of these positions. So that's what I did, and even though at this point it's almost futile, they went ahead and played h4 anyway, and I wasn't sure whether to play h5 or h6, so I just played that. They took, which I didn't think was their best move in the position. Going back, it looks like they should have just pushed their g-pawn forward. It would have been protected by both their h-pawn and their bishop at that point, and it would have forced my knight to move somewhere, probably here. And then I don't know if we would have had a trade or not. But that would have been their better move here. But it wasn't. Actually, it lost a good little bit and gave me a slightly higher advantage to do that. That doubles their h-file pawns. Also, I have three pieces pointed here. Let me change the color there. So that gave me a little bit of an advantage. And I took with the piece that Stockfish thinks I should take with, which comes with tempo because their queen is in front of that. I thought they were going to block with their bishop. And Stockfish says if they had done that, I would have slid back. But I think if they had blocked with their bishop, I would have taken it. I don't know. But instead they moved their queen, which makes this move earlier make sense now, because now it looks like they're prepared to castle. I'm not ready to castle yet. I've already lost my H-pawn. I don't know if I want to castle on that side, and it's looking a little weak on the other side, so I may not get to castle in this game. But I do know I need to get this bishop out, so I played e6. And my opponent played their best move here, which is to directly challenge this bishop. The problem here, I think, is that it was late. They could have just done that on the previous turn, couldn't they? Before they moved their queen. Because even though their queen was in the line of fire, they could have just moved this, and that would have either precipitated a trade or forced my bishop back. But so they kind of wasted a turn to get to a very similar thing. When Stockfish says I should just drop this back. So I lost a little bit of advantage by taking the bishop. I do know that in Caro compositions, very often we trade light squared bishops. Usually it's here and here. Usually I've gotten my light squared bishop here outside the pawn chain, and they challenge me here. And this pawn isn't there. This pawn's over here. So we end up trading light squared bishops over on d3. But regardless, I'm used to exchanging the light squared bishops. They took with their queen. And, I'm supposed to play here now? I guess because they've damaged all this over here on the king side, that Stockfish is expecting them to castle queen side. And this might mess that up with a little bit of disruption of the structure. And I had just played e6, so I was intending to get out the dark squared bishop. But it looked to me like they were about to castle queenside, so I wanted my queen over there. I see now that Stockfish says a5 would have been good, but I went to b6. Not that great, but then they castled. No, then, sorry, Stockfish says they're supposed to castle queenside here, but they played that, and that was counted as a blunder. The problem with this move is that I can check. I didn't see the best one. You can see directly above my head here that b4 was the square I should have checked from. I saw the next best one, which is 4 points difference in evaluation. Now the difference is this. b4 keeps me lined up with the b pawn while checking and threatening the knight. So the knight, the b pawn, and the king are all hit from the same square. What I actually played was to a5, which only does 2 of those things. It still threatens the knight while checking, but the other way, had I seen it, and I'm going over it here so I'll see it again when this situation arises, that here, just like when I checked on a5, they can still block with their knight if they want to. But if they do, I will take this pawn and be forking their knight and their rook. And so when they move their rook, I will win their knight for free. And they'll be in check at that point. And so here, they would block with their c pawn, and I would win their knight outright. So that's much better. But when they moved out here, and I checked on a5 instead, that just lets them move their knight back and block the check, which is what they did. But that's okay. It means that they undid their last move. I'm still going forward, still forcing them to make moves, still taking the initiative. And here, because their knight is pinned, I played knight to d5. Stockfish isn't really happy about that. It wants bishop to b4. It surprisingly wants bishop to a3. That is sneaky because it looks like a free bishop, but that pawn is defending the knight. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I didn't see that either. Or knight b to d7, just developing another piece. Okay. Well, what I played was this, putting pressure on the knight, but also threatening the bishop. And they saw that I was threatening the bishop and the knight, so they moved the bishop back to protect the knight, which seems like a reasonable move on their part. I decided to take the knight anyway, and they took back, which means I have to move my queen. But now this pawn is hanging, so that kind of determines where I will move the queen, so that's what I did. Stockfish wants this. I don't know if... I think if I had been my opponent, I would have gone ahead and castled here. Stockfish isn't liking that. Stockfish wants f3 or a3. Not sure exactly what a3 would do, or long castle. What they did instead was try to get this knight out over on that side. And I think I understand their point. I think they were coming here hoping to give a one-move threat against my queen. But had they done that, I think I would have just slid here, which would have threatened their knight, and continued protecting the pawn. That's the only thing I can think was the idea for that move. Or possibly to develop a piece. They couldn't develop it to its normal square because the normal square is hit by my pawn right now. Maybe that's what they were thinking. And here I'm supposed to play. This is another one that I missed because I didn't see it. When they moved here, their rook isn't protecting that pawn anymore. And that's why Stockfish wants me to take that pawn. Well, I didn't see that. I saw the next best move, which was to develop my bishop. And then here they long castled. Now I do have a -3 advantage at this point. I decided, just like my opponent, I need to develop a piece, but instead of developing it to probably what would have been the better square, I developed it to the rim just like my opponent did. But I had a specific idea going on here. I wanted to attack over here on this side. And first, I wanted to get rid of that bishop. And so I was trying to think of how to get rid of that bishop. I could bring the knight here, threatening the check and the fork. And if they took it, of course, I would take back. I could put the bishop here, which maybe would drive their bishop back a little further. And then, I don't know. That was one of the reasonings that I had besides behind putting the knight out there. And my opponent, I guess, saw what I was thinking, so they did pull the bishop back. The problem with pulling the bishop back, of course, is that it cuts off an escape square for the king. So now, when I check down there, their only good moves are to get out of the way of the king, because the king is going to need to escape when I check down here. C3 is an option, which would complete a little pawn chain here, but most importantly, it's to give the king an escape square. Bishop to G5 is fine. Again, to give the king an escape square. C4 is also suggested for the same reason. And before Stockfish settled on its recommendations, I noticed that it had said move the rook over. That would have allowed, I don't remember which square it said to move the rook to. That would have, what would that have done? That still would have been mate, right? So I don't know why it was suggesting that. Yeah, I think it's got to be the pawn or the bishop to get out of the way. But instead they did that. And this is where I need to tell you that my opponent was ranked a little bit lower than me, a few hundred points lower than me. And I've noticed a lot when I play opponents rated much higher than me, as well as when I play opponents rated much lower than me. The difference isn't that one player is smarter or one player is dumber. Or that we think differently. It's a lot of it is a matter of experience, and that we're looking at the same pieces on the same board with the same rules and the same knowledge of the rules of chess, but we're looking at them differently because of our experience. And here, I knew that if they didn't move one of these pieces, that the next move would be checkmate. And my opponent didn't know that they were in that serious of danger. They saw when I moved my queen and took a pawn, well, I've undefended this pawn, which was the reason I moved my queen over there in the first place, was to defend that pawn. And they saw that I've undefended it and didn't see how much trouble they were in. Whereas the more experience that this player, my opponent, thank you for the game, by the way. I believe you're one of my subscribers here on YouTube. One of the most important things to look for on every turn after the first few moves is, are there checks possible? Does the opponent have a way to check me? And if so, how serious is that check going to be? Especially once pieces have been developed out into the middle of the board from where they can attack. And this is something that, as I've gained more experience over the last year and a half, I've looked for in every turn. Before I played this move, I knew that I wasn't going to be checkmate on the next turn because they would probably move one of those two pieces. And then I would have to figure out where to go next from there, whether to bring in my knight, depending on what they played. Like if they played this, I wouldn't have been able to bring in my knight. I would have had to try something else. Perhaps trying to distract this pawn away so I could get my bishop here aiming down at this pawn or something like that. But I knew that this check was serious, and I knew that this would be mate if they didn't move one of those pieces. So anyway, something to look out for once that especially queens, are out in the middle. Where can they check me from? What defenses do I have against it? What escape squares does my king have? King safety beats everything else when it comes to these kinds of situations. Again, thank you for the game. This is my 500th win with the black pieces. And I've already passed 500 wins with the white pieces, but I forgot to mark that milestone, which means I've won over 1,000 games since I begun playing chess on these sites. Pretty happy about my progress so far. And getting close to 2,000 games overall when you combine white and black pieces, and I will try to remember to mark that milestone. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.